Today, we're taking this PlayStation and elevating it to meet today's standards. We're going to update how it connects to our TVs, how we connect to it, and even how it connects to our games. The PlayStation is one of the most iconic gaming consoles ever released, a monster for its time. Spawned from a broken alliance, it saw the rise of many of gaming's great franchises and has been so in demand that every subsequent PlayStation generation has supported PS1 games, at least in some way. Sony even released a PlayStation Mini during the mini console craze, though it was a very bare bones effort that only really became worth it once hackers got their hands on it. But there's nothing quite like playing games on the hardware they were designed for and as the developer intended. And the PlayStation, well, it certainly has plenty of games, 4,103 to be exact. But this thing came out 30 years ago, and a lot has changed in the world of technology since then that prevents this from being the best way to play those games. Luckily, there are plenty of dedicated fans out there who've come up with elegant solutions to fix these deficiencies. So today we're going to install 3 mods into this thing, and while the first 2 are pretty involved and challenging, I promise the last one's a breeze. But in order to elevate this console, we first have to tear it down. Let's get into this thing. Now, the first thing to note before you maybe decide you want to tackle something like this is that this is the 5501 version of the console, and some of the mods we're doing today are specifically compatible with this version. If you're going to attempt any of these mods, you want to make sure they're compatible with the console version you have. The second thing to note is just how easy it is to get inside of one of these retro consoles. Unlike today's system with their 50 screws, their security torque heads, and their paired SSDs and SoCs that make them so hard to repair, it's all very simple and straightforward, and all you need is a Phillips head. And with that, you can remove the few screws holding the motherboard to the case. With the console disassembled, the first issue we're going to tackle is actually an issue that makes this PlayStation completely unplayable in its current state. It's not the power supply, it does power on. It's not a display issue, that also works, but it's that. That laser doesn't want to read discs. This was actually the whole catalyst for this video. Sure, I could buy a replacement laser or cannibalize one from another console. That's simple enough, but likely only a temporary fix because eventually that replacement is going to fail as well. So I got to wondering, is there a better solution? Something like OPL for the PS2, and after some research into mods for this thing, I discovered that yeah, there is, and in some ways, it's actually better than OPL. This is the Xstation ODE, or Optical Disk Drive Emulator. I bought this from GameTech.us, and I'll leave a link in the description below in case it's something you're interested in picking up. It's not an affiliate link or anything like that, just it's who I bought from. But what this does and what makes it super cool is it emulates the laser assembly itself. It acts as a replacement laser, sending all of the data the laser would read from a game disc to the console to process. And it does so without needing a mechanical laser assembly that's bound to fail again, or the game disc that risks being scratched or cracked. You just install the backup copies of your games on a micro SD card and this can do the rest. Best of all, unlike other ways of tricking your consoles into playing games from files, this thing is pretty much capable of playing every game released for the PS1. On top of that, you can play games from any region, and as a bonus, it even loads faster. But before it can do any of that, we have to install it somehow. To install this mod and the others, we're gonna have to do some pretty serious soldering. There's no way around it. These are hardware modifications, not software manipulation, meaning we're gonna have to actually tap into the data lines and power rails on this thing in order to get them working. While you can get away with using an old Radio Shack basic soldering iron, I've always recommended more robust, powerful stations to get the job done consistently. And today I have this WEP 982D soldering station. Now, this video isn't sponsored by WEP, but they did send this over to me for free, and I've been using it for my last couple of repairs, and I really have enjoyed it, especially the C245 handle it came with, as that one is able to draw more power than the C210 I was using on my previous station, meaning it's far more capable when working on newer devices with thicker boards and bigger ground planes. It came with 3 tips for each handle, which gives you all the variety you need to tackle different problems, and because it's a cartridge style station, you're able to hot swap the tips in a flash and get right back to the job. I'll leave an affiliate link down below if you're interested in checking them out. For now, let's get back to the soldering. The first thing we need to do is remove this outer RF shield, which means pulling out our soldering iron. Now to remove this, we'll add a bit of flux to the legs and then soak up that solder using a copper wick. You see, solder just loves to bond to copper, and when heated by your iron, it works its way right up the braided metal. The flux is there to really help the solder melt and flow right up the wick. Whenever you're soldering, just remember, flux is your friend. There is one leg under the shield that's a bit of a pain to get to, but eventually I managed to work it free. The nice thing is there's not really any components around it, so you don't have to be too careful about your soldering iron touching something bad. Now to actually install the X station, we're going to start by lifting a few pins on this chip. And I know if you've never done anything like this, it might seem daunting, but it's not quite as bad as you might think. As with most soldering, patience is key, as is flux. I'm using a very fine tip to melt the solder, and then you need something very sharp like tweezers or a pin to lift the pins free from the pad. Before the next step, we have to scratch away at a few points we need to connect to and tin them with some solder. Next, remove this resistor. The QSB or quick solder board goes on next and connects via these points that line up oh so neatly. Just add a little flux and touch up the points with a bit of leaded solder. Now you may wonder, why leaded solder? Isn't that bad for you? And yes, it is if you ingest it, so don't do that. But leaded solder actually melts at a lower temperature than unleaded solder, meaning you can work at lower temperatures with your iron or hot air station, thereby subjecting the board and components to less heat, and we all know heat's an electronics killer. Isn't that right, Xbox? With that board installed, we have to attach a wire from the QSB to right above where we removed that resistor earlier. This one part needs to come off to make room for the ribbon cable, and then just hook everything up with the cable. Now, with that installed, I'm going to test this first before I do anything else, just to make sure we did that all right. All right, so now that we got that working, and it does work, just a little tip, if you're not going to fully reassemble your console, you do want to make sure that that button right here for the lid is pushed down. Otherwise, you're just going to get the memory card, CD-ROM screen, and you're not going to get to the actual games on here. But now that we've got that done, we're going to have to tear it back apart to get to our next mod. With that working, we can now turn our attention to the second issue we have with this PlayStation, and that's this port right here. You see, this PlayStation only has the AV multi-port, which leaves us pretty much stuck with the composite, also known as RCA connection. And while my 2011 LG TV is capable of accepting a composite signal, most TVs these days have moved on to better connections. And just because it can accept a signal doesn't mean it's the best way of displaying that signal. I mean, just look at that screen. You see the composite signal is an analog signal, and this is an LCD TV, and it can only display a digital signal, meaning the analog signal gets converted to digital in the TV, which degrades the signal along the way. I'm sure we've all seen how bad retro consoles look on modern flat screen TVs. The signals coming out of the console were just not meant for these high definition widescreen televisions, and it shows. And it's even worse because the signal actually starts out as digital in the console before being converted to analog in the console, and then ultimately back to digital in the TV. But what if we could just skip that whole analog conversion and have a direct digital to digital signal like modern consoles have? Well, that's where this comes in. This is the RetroGem HD, and it does just that. It allows you to tap directly into the digital signals the PlayStation creates and connect the audio and video up to your TV. And best of all, it does it with an HDMI port, the king of all ports, at least for now. Let's see what it takes to get this installed. And one thing to note, because I didn't realize it until after installing this and trying to test it, is that the HDMI port on the RetroGem is actually a mini HDMI port, not a full-size port. So you're going to need a proper cable or adapter to actually plug into this thing. Also, this is a very intense mod. I'd say it's a step above the Xstation mod in terms of steps and skills, because you're having to do a lot of tapping into data lines and using ribbon cables to actually connect to these chips. But let's get started. First, let's turn our attention to the serial port because that has to come out. Now you could use a hot air station, but honestly, I think in this case with these through pins, a soldering iron with some copper wick works best because these pins seem to get easily bent, making it kind of hard to remove even without solder on there. And when using hot air, you need all of the solder to melt at once so the port can slip out. But if it's wanting to give you trouble, then you're just subjecting the board to more heat for longer, and we don't want that at all. With the solder wicked up, that port can come free, and we can replace a few resistors on the board as well as these caps, which is a perfect chance to use the hot tweezers WEP sent over as well. This is really one of the best cases for hot tweezers because it allows you to grab the caps from both sides, melting both pads at once so it comes free. It's definitely a lot less potentially damaging to the board than the twist off method or cut off method, and there's less chance of these blowing compared to using hot air. With these, it's just touch and pull away. There are 3 ribbon cables we need to install, one for the controller port so your controller can talk to the RetroGem, one for the audio because what makes something like this so great is that it's able to capture the initial digital audio signal and route that right through the HDMI port. No digital to audio converter and then reconverting that back to digital, just a pure signal, which is great because one of the things that made the PlayStation so great was its use of CD-based games capable of high quality sounds, especially compared to its rival, the N64, that was forced to compress its audio so it could fit on the cartridges. With this, we can experience those sounds with crystal clarity. The final ribbon cable is a monster. This is the one that taps into the digital image and sends it through the HDMI port. Now, I have to be honest here and pause it right here. You see that? Yeah, that's not lined up correctly. I thought it was, it looked like it was, but it was only after I completely installed it and tried testing it that I realized it wasn't. So don't do it like this. It should be over one more pin. Yeah, I know, pretty bad. But with it hopefully in the correct location, you just tap a soldering tip to the pad so the solder can flow. I actually found it easiest and quickest to use a chisel tip. It delivers more consistent heat and can flow solder along a few pins at a time. Just remember to add flux, and if you bridge anything, take your time and add more flux to clear that bridge. It shouldn't be too detrimental. But here's about the point I realized I'd messed something up. Luckily, these are fairly forgiving parts, so I just had to remove the cable carefully and reattach it properly. The problem was, and this is something I should have triple checked, with the ribbon out of place, it did send a voltage line to something it shouldn't have, and that unfortunately blew this fuse. Luckily, I had another fuse I could pull from a spare PS1. And with all these mistakes sorted out, we could hook it up and finally get an HDMI signal. But that wasn't the end of my troubles, because then the X-Station stopped booting properly. I attached 2 wires, cut one little trace to install the lid mod the RetroGem allows, but still, it wouldn't get back to that screen. I tried reformatting the SD card and ultimately decided to try resoldering the QSB, which unfortunately resulted in a few ripped pads, which was actually very unfortunate because I'm not very good at repairing ripped traces. But with some perseverance, I did manage to get the QSB reinstalled, and that seemed to have done the trick because now the X-Station boots up right away. While the main purpose of the RetroGem is to provide an HDMI port so your PlayStation can hook up to modern TVs, it actually can do a lot more than just that to help improve the overall visuals of the games. Once we finish up these mods and start testing them out, we can go over the benefits something like this has over other options. And speaking of other options, there are cheaper and easier alternatives out there I want you to be aware of for hooking your PlayStation up via HDMI. While they do a fine job and will certainly get you playing your PlayStation games on modern TVs no problem, they do have a few drawbacks, most of which revolve around the fact that they're still just converting the analog signal to digital before transmitting it to the TV. So it's going to have similar visual issues like we saw on my TV. You really can't beat having access to the direct digital signal when it comes to trying to have the best clarity and accuracy for your games. The RetroGem is the best digital to digital converter I found, but if you know of something better or at least similar enough but cheaper, let me know down in the comments below because I might end up recommending it over this because this certainly is a bit of a luxury item. With the RetroGem installed, now we can reassemble the console, but first let's give this thing a quick bath and clean it up a bit. That's much better. Now I have something I've never had before. A very new looking and very modern PlayStation 1. I don't know if you can tell, but I like original hardware. Kind of the reason I started this channel in the first place to help preserve them. I love that it's sort of like a sleeper console. You really wouldn't be able to tell from the outside what we've done to it. Turn it around, sure, you'll notice the HDMI port, but just sitting in the stand next to its younger brothers, it looks so ordinary, but to me, that's what makes it so extraordinary. And it's only missing one more thing to fully elevate this console, and that revolves around this. This is a perfectly fine controller with one limitation: the cord. Adequate for 1995, but not so much for 2025. And as I said in the beginning, the first 2 mods were a bit of a bear, but this one, not so much. We're taking the easy way out today, okay? We're going with one of these Bluetooth receivers from 8BitDo. With this, you can connect your PS4, PS5, Xbox One, Series, even Wii U Pro Controller and Switch Pro Controller to your PlayStation 1 or PlayStation 2, which means this one adapter is the perfect addition to this console elevation. Of course, it can also connect to many of 8BitDo's own controllers, and I already happen to have an 8BitDo SN30 Pro, so this works out perfectly for me. 8BitDo really does make some of the best third-party controllers out there. They even have a DIY kit you can use to convert your original PlayStation controller to wireless. Unfortunately, it's not intended for the DualShock controllers, though hopefully they'll come out with something for those soon. That would be nice. For now, this little receiver does the job perfectly, and I don't even care about the dongle sticking out because we're gonna have one right above it in the memory card. Now, I really wanted to get a Mem Card Pro for this thing, and I probably will in the future. It's just that they're out of stock for the original Mem Card Pro right now, and it looks like they're gearing up to release the Mem Card Pro 2 probably a month or so after this video releases. The Mem Card Pro 2 promises to be the last memory card you'll ever need for your PS1 or PS2 and has enough space to hold all your game saves. Unfortunately, an original memory card like this, while very reliable, only has enough space for a handful of games, and sometimes only enough space for one game. If you're going to roll through a lot of games, and with these mods, I mean, who isn't? It's going to end up being cheaper to buy a Mem Card Pro 1 or 2 over dozens of OEM memory cards. Hopefully they can release some more soon. Now that we've got everything installed, we can pair up our controller just like that, and we can finally get a chance to put these mods to use. The real gem of it all is that RetroGem HD, and with it we can see just how improved the graphics are compared to the original composite cables. And one of the amazing things about the RetroGem is it actually allows you to output both the analog composite cables and digital HDMI at the same time. You didn't have to remove anything from the analog side of it, and remember, it wasn't the output port we removed, but the serial port that was never really utilized. So I only have the basic RetroGem, which does limit the resolutions and some of the other things you can tweak, but I'm still really happy with the way it looks on my TV. It's sharper, the colors are great, and best of all is that mini HDMI port, which allows easy hookup to modern TVs and even an HDMI capture card if I want to capture some gameplay. And that's gonna do it for this PlayStation Elevation. And while I really like the mods and what they're trying to do, I do have some concerns over just how finicky they are. I've run into audio issues and still have some times when I turn the PlayStation on and it doesn't want to load up the Xstation. I also found the documentation on installation for both, including the lid bypass, to be just a little lacking and sometimes hard to find, if I'm honest. But there is a great support community out there willing to help out as best they can to troubleshoot any issues you run into, and I think that's what saves these and makes them worthy of recommendation. I've thought about making a more detailed video of the installation process that just goes more in-depth with the mods and how to install them step by step. If that's something you'd be interested in, let me know down in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll catch you in the next one.